On August 14, 1941, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill issued a joint declaration setting out the basic principles of the post-war world. This Atlantic Charter became the precursor not only to the United Nations Organization, but also to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was designed to provide collective security to all its members and was open to any other European state in a position to further the principles of this treaty and to contribute to the security of the North Atlantic area. Today, NATO has 28 member states and is the most effective supranational military organization the world has ever known. 155 years before the Atlantic Charter, US Ambassador to France Thomas Jefferson penned, in collaboration with his friend the Marquis de Lafayette, the details of a confederation between the young American Republic and any European states desiring to join, designed to provide its members collective security against the Barbary pirate states of the Western Mediterranean. These pirates forced European states, as well as the USA, to pay tribute to them in order to continue unmolested to transit for trade and other purposes through their seas. This confederation had therefore as object to compel the piratical states to perpetual peace without price and to guarantee that peace to each other. Its membership was to remain open to any other power who shall at any future time wish to accede to it. Jefferson proposed that this confederation be led by a permanent council to which each participating state would name a representative. It would reach decisions by a majority vote based on each country's contribution to the Confederation's budget. Lafayette volunteered to lead the Confederation's forces, a standing navy assembled specifically to combat piracy. Although a number of smaller European nations were favorable to Jefferson and Lafayette's visionary plans for collective security, both France and England were opposed. We can only imagine the path that the history of Europe and North America might have taken if the foundations of transatlantic collective security had been laid down in 1786. The opportunity to create a fundamentally different future was as real then as in 1941, yet it was missed. In its place arose one of the most violent and deadly periods of European history. Instead of Jefferson and Lafayette's supranational convergence based on common values and institutions, hypernationalism burst on the scene as the legitimating principle of modern states. Not even the Vienna Congress era that kept a relatively peaceful balance of power in Europe for the next 6 decades after Napoleon's final defeat could quench the wildfires of such nationalisms. They went on smoldering and erupting periodically, then gradually inflaming the old continent and the entire world. Gilbert Dumotier, Marquis de Lafayette, volunteered at the age of 19 to fight in the US War of Independence. He returned to France as the standard bearer of constitutional reform and helped persuade King Louis XVI to sign a constitution and the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen that Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson had drafted. As Captain General of the National Guard, Lafayette organized the mass celebrations of the Fête de la Fédération on July 14, 1790, and took the solemn civic oath to be ever faithful to the nation, to the law, and to the king, to support with our utmost power the Constitution decreed by the National Assembly and accepted by the king. He could easily have seized supreme power then, as did General Bonaparte 9 years later. But true to his oath and to his ideal of constitutional government achieved by legitimate means, he refused to do so. Lafayette had 2 other opportunities to take hold of the reins of government in France. In the last days of Napoleon's reign in July 1815, when he was instrumental in forcing the emperor's abdication, and 15 years later, when another French Revolution ousted the last Bourbon king and was ready to proclaim the hero of 2 worlds, French ruler. Steadfast in his belief that true moderation consists, not as many people seem to think, in always seeking the middle point between any 2 points, but in trying to recognize the point of truth and holding on to it, he again refused to accept such an unconstitutional grant of power. He remained true to the end to his belief in legitimate, constitutional governments and free political institutions. Lafayette was also persuaded that true freedom and liberty could not be achieved in just one country or for one group of people, but only for all nations and all races. He continued to struggle in France for freedom as he did in the New World, and provided assistance to Italian, Polish, and Greek independence movements. He also tried to persuade successive US presidents to emancipate all slaves, and supported abolitionist movements in Europe and the Americas. These are the twin pillars of Lafayette's Gambit: constitutional, legitimate government based on the values of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and the logical necessity of struggling for this ideal not only for one nation, but across borders for all peoples and races. Only these universal ideals are capable of creating an asabiya for the emerging global civil society powerful enough to persuade its members to set course towards one common heading. For ideas, values, and ideologies are the key means of strengthening the asabiya, or social capital, that endows groups and institutions with the resilience necessary to endure and outlast their rivals. Ideas matter not only in and of themselves, but also as the indispensable ingredients that power individuals to coalesce in groups strong enough to bring about both incremental and radical change, and thus to reposition them from the fringes of an old social system to the core of a new one. These two functions must be kept conceptually apart, so as not to confuse the actual value of such ideals with ideological ends they serve: to strengthen groups asabiyas across the social divides separating their members, and to enable them to achieve dominant positions in their social ecosystem. Putnam showed that there are two types of social capital: bonding, which strengthens the asabiya of a predefined social group, and bridging, capable of transcending such differences and creating entirely new groups. We can label these different orientations universalism and particularism. States and societies adopt over time three different approaches to the need for institutional change. They defend the status quo, they support incremental change, they militate in favor of revolutionary transformations. These options can be each subdivided into universalist and particularist variants. The other key variable that differentiates approaches to institutional change is whether a social structure views the notion of power as an authoritarian power over its subjects, or as a participatory power with its citizens. Both have different levels of intensity. When we combine these two social approaches to power and their various levels of intensity with the three institutional preferences for change mentioned above, each with their universalist and particularist variants, we obtain a regeneration matrix. This matrix helps us understand how institutions evolve over time and how they employ various ideologies to either create alliances or maintain conflicts in order to improve their own position relative to that of their rivals. Lafayette understood that a fundamental historical fault line between rival institutions of government was that between participatory ones, however imperfect, and authoritarian ones, however enlightened, and that particularist approaches to change had to be overcome by universalist ones. His universalist participatory approach required radical systemic change from the absolutist monarchies that were then the norm in Europe. The hypernationalist approach to institutional change, first championed by Napoleon and ended up trumping Lafayette and Jefferson's early attempts to create a transatlantic confederation. It took 1.5 centuries before Europe and North America were able to return to such a participatory universalist approach. And even then, not so as to bring about the radical change required by the times, but only to shore up the existent international system against the challenges of other societies militating in favor of authoritarian change. The regeneration matrix shows us that Europe and North America face now a difficult double challenge. An internal one of reforming their own institutions so as to help them cope with the radical systemic changes required by today's historical moment, and an external one of resisting the challenges posed by authoritarian regimes of both universalist and particularist tendencies. The twin pillars of Lafayette's Gambit provide us with the key values necessary to achieve both. They can bring together the emerging international civil society and provide it with powerful bridging social capital that will enable it to successfully transcend its current internal and external existential crises. This is the endeavor that we must now rededicate ourselves to, an unrelenting and steadfast struggle for radical institutional change, to extend freedom and equal dignity for all in a legitimate and peaceful manner, not only in one country or one group of people, but across the entire world and for us all.